Good afternoon, and welcome to Sage for H and another IR Theory interview. In this interview series, we interview IR scholars about their preferred theoretical perspectives. The idea is to get a brief account of why scholars have come to appreciate a certain IR theory through a short interview. Today, I have the honor to interview Derick Becker. Welcome, Derick.
How's it going, mate?
Nice to have you here. Nice to have you in the IR Theory interview series.
Nice seeing you again.
Yeah, nice. So please, before we start to really dive into what we might call a spatial theory of IR, could you tell us a little bit about your scholarly background?
My background? Oh, well, I mean, I'm a political economist, mostly theoretical work, but I've done a lot of foreign policy work. Most of my work substantively focuses on Africa. I wrote a dissertation and eventually a book on the state in Africa. Economic policy was the dissertation thing. I've done a lot of stuff on Ethiopian foreign policy, some of it with you, things like that. Lately, though, I'm much more theoretical. The kinds of questions I focus on now are like human consciousness and the nature of the social world and whatnot. And as you say, spatial theory, only because I don't have another name for it. So we just call it spatial theory, that kind of thing. So that's mostly my background. That and bouncing around from college to college. Here I am in Malaysia now. Not that that's relevant, but.
Yeah. So it's irrelevant. So you say bouncing around from college to college. Where have you been working?
Oh, well, I've actually taught at some really impressive liberal arts colleges in the U.S., Colgate University, which, yes, does have a connection to the toothpaste, but it's also a very well-known, highly respected liberal arts university in New York, and Whitman, and then I've worked at McAllister in Minneapolis, Augsburg in Minneapolis. For a while, I worked in Europe and Bosnia, and now I work for the University of Nottingham at their campus here in Malaysia. It's just the reality of some bits of academia these days is it's a lot of term hires, not tenure. So move around. But now I have a more stable, more permanent gig. And anyway, I got to travel a lot, so there's no downside to that. So.
Yes. So it's hard to get tenure, and you have to accept some form of academic nomadic life. But that has been good, at least for you.
It has been, yeah. I mean, I was looking at a job in India before this, and like I said, I lived in Europe, and I take a year off here and there and travel, and I've been all over, South America, Southeast Asia, Asia in general, and stuff like that. So being very itinerant could be very beneficial. It's where I wrote the book, was wandering around, laptop and notes. So not bad.
That's cool. So thank you a lot for telling us about that. So if we go to the more specific stuff about IR theory, so if you were to choose two or three core concepts of the spatial theory of IR, which ones would you choose and why?
I thought about that when you mentioned it earlier, because I was trying to figure out, can you give it a name for the specific concepts, or are there just 3 points? And I tried to figure out if they had names, and I, to the best of my knowledge, they don't, but they have 3 major points in there. And I think they could be summed up fairly simply. One of the things I think that stands out about any kind of spatial theory, particularly as it emerges from Lefebvre, and it's certainly compatible with Brenner's work and whatnot, is that you have a theory of international relations that it tries to explain the social, material world, institutions, all that stuff, ideas, everything like that, that is grounded in an understanding of the individual as social and material as well. So it's a very rare theory in international relations that's actually grounded in an understanding of the individual. And so the social material world emerges out of the very social materiality of the human being itself. That I find very, very interesting. What can you name that as a concept? I'm not sure, but it's certainly an interesting point. I think another point of it is that in general, it views both you as an individual, but also society as something that's in the process of becoming or unfolding. And that's actually the subtitle of my book was, the state of becoming. And that is that it's a constant unfolding. And there are interesting overlaps with that and the physical sciences when they talk about complex systems and whatnot. Ilya Prigogine has this whole thing about the world as becoming. So there's an interesting overlap there, that it's this constant thing. And that has some interesting ramifications. It eliminates the possibility of thinking about international relations or anything in the social sciences is having law-like properties. There's no necessitarian logic to it, to echo Roberto Ongar. And the third point is actually probably the easiest one, is all space is political. And that, I don't think I have to go much deeper into. It brings back the normativity that I think a lot of positivist social science gets rid of. The very fact that the economic systems are the product of political choice. They are not there due to the inevitable laws. Economics does not follow inevitable natural laws. These are the result of decisions. We build institutions, we build rules, we build regulations, and it all seems to give patterns to the world that we study and go, oh, that's why they exist. Well, they have a history to them, and they reflect the ability of people to make those laws. But it also means they're subject to change. So all space is political to me is very interesting, because it really deepens the emancipatory politics that a lot of at least post-positivist social scientists like to get into. But it grounds this in a very, I think, accurate understanding of how the world operates.
Okay, so to summarize, so the individual should be viewed in its social materiality, or its social and material context, so to speak. And the concept of becoming, or the state as becoming, and then that all space is political. And then when you went through the third point, you also mentioned emancipatory. Would you then equate this spatial theory of IR, perhaps not equate, but is this concept of emancipation similar to a concept of emancipation that we can find in the Frankfurt School and critical theories, for instance?
Not necessarily, because those have some idea of what that the end point of emancipation would be. Recognizing that the world is constantly unfolding and that it is the product of decisions, choices, and the institutions that are there, doesn't mean that there is an end point. It's always subject to change. I've been reading a lot of Roberto Ongar lately. He says one of the problems with Marxism in general, despite the fact that they look at things as history unfolding, is that they do treat it as inevitable sets of laws that lead to it, and they have an ideal endpoint that says, here's what the free individual looks like. And I think that's problematic, because even if you were to create what looked like a very free society, people who are born into it might say, it's not perfect for me. I mean, we can think about the way in which gender identity and gender fluidity is emerging as a new ground for social contestation, identity, and that of course occurs in the background of women's lib and feminism and all gay rights, queer politics in general, which in and of itself was pushing the boundaries. So even when you make space freer and more emancipated, someone else is going to come along and go, thank you, but now in my own experience, or we in our experience in this community, feel like we need to change it. So you never want to specify that endpoint. What you want to do, I mean, if you have the ideal sets of institutions, the ones that maximize the potential to allow it to occur. But the empirical side of it is just to look at the reality that the way the world is organized definitely matters, and it constrains what's possible, but not inevitably so. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's not really the same as the concept of emancipation that we can find in critical theories.
No.
And in what you say now, I hear also an anti-utopian critique, or at least the understanding that there is political struggle, and that political struggle will always exist. We will never reach that kind of endpoint.
I think one of the benefits of realizing the space is political and realizing that there's a history to it, isn't so much that you deny a utopian ideal. It is the way in which a lot of political debate kind of gets framed by the horizon of what is considered possible, the realms of possibility. And if you're a positivist, you're an economist or whatnot, you're sitting there saying the laws of the market are this. And if it doesn't work for you, that sucks. These are natural laws. Well, they're not. But that doesn't mean anything is possible. There are institutions that are there. There's a real distribution of income. There are real limitations of our ideas and whatnot that are out there. But by recognizing there's a history and recognizing that it's malleable, it certainly means having an understanding of how the world is organized means that you can certainly come up with a new way of organizing it. You don't want your radical ideas to be dismissed as utopian, but you also don't want your utopian ideals to be kind of the be all end all where you say, if I can't have it, I can't have anything. Like Roberto Ongara talks about revolutionary reformism, which is kind of a weird term. Reformism is revolutionary, but it's like you move the ship of state bit by bit by bit, and eventually it's somewhere else. So I think there's a clear emancipatory utopian role there, but we want to eliminate the idea that it's unrealistic, because I think that's the corollary of utopian is unrealistic. I don't think that's true.
Okay, interesting. Interesting. So
it could be the whiskey.
Yeah, it could be. Okay, so social material, or the individual in a social material world, the concept of becoming, and that all space is political. So if you compare your understanding of the individual in this social material world, how would you say that contrasts to an understanding of the individual informed by rational choice theory?
Well, rational choice theory never really, as far as I can tell, and it depends on which one of these guys you ask, they never really argue that what they're describing theoretically is an accurate description of how humans actually behave. And I believe that's why you have behavioral economics is making a significant impact on economics itself, because they say, well, it's just a simplification of the world. And so we don't pretend that that's accurate. But on the other hand, it deeply influences policy and regulations and things like that. And so it tends to look like the world works that way because we build the rules that guide our behavior, what we would call space in a spatial theory, so that it kind of looks that way. It's sort of like when you find out that the Swiss, their foreign affairs office uses game theory in negotiations, and they're like, it works. And I'm like, well, if you use this to decide what you're going to do and then you go and do it, that's not really all that surprising that it works. So it depends on which rat theorist. Some of them admit it's definitely not real, and others go, it's real enough. But when we say that we have to situate the individual in the socio-material context, spatial theory goes a little bit farther. It talks about you as a person as socio-material. I mean, Lefebvre has this term where he says, not only are we in space, we are a body that occupies space. And that physical nature is something we feel in the world, but we also conceive of it in the world. He has a very interesting set of quotes about how the human heart is both something that is felt in a kind of stressful sense. It has a biological nature, its real nature. But then there's also that heart in the poetic sense. And he says, can you separate any of those things from your existence? You can't, because it's all one. So you as a person are socio-material, not studied just in a socio-material context. That's what you are. You know what I mean?
So almost in a metaphysical sense.
Yeah. Because when you think about it, though, like because I deal with this with stuff on consciousness, like what makes me who I am. If you realize that, your interactions with other people and whatnot are, their entanglement with them come to define who you are as a Swedish person, as an American, married to a Bosnian, things like that. They define that. So am I nothing more than that? Well, your experience is fundamentally unique. But your identity over time is you living these experiences and internalizing lessons and thoughts and knowledge. You are the product of that, and you are unique because of that. That's also where the theory of becoming is, that you're constantly unfolding. And the reason I find it interesting with spatial theory when it comes to the social world in general is that it extends the exact same logic right over into the world as a whole. And you simply don't see that in most IR theory. Lefebvre starts with the human and ends with globalization. I've never seen a book that's done that before. And you just don't see it. And I think that's cool.
He transcends levels, or rather scales. Scales rather than levels, right? Okay. Thank you very much for that elaboration. Very interesting. So let us continue. So if we go to policy, in terms of policy relevance, how would a spatial theory of IR inform policy?
Well, in general, I always say that if you're worried about policy, then why are you in academia? But there can be. I have actually worked on a congressional campaign before, so I have put these ideas into practice. And so there can be ways. You just have to not talk about theory. But I mean, obviously, the first one is there is an emancipatory politics there. And so the world can change. And when we talk about what are the policy options in front of us, you have to have an honest understanding of exactly how the world is organized. When we talk about institutions, we talk about the flows of humans, but we also talk about flows of capital, the flows of goods. You need to have an honest perception of understanding of how those things work and precisely why they work if you want to change that. If we start talking about transforming global tax policy, we have to have an understanding of the way capital moves around the world and the way it bounces between various legal jurisdictions, which give it the ability to do certain things that it can't do in other places. You've heard of what is it, the double Dutch Irish sandwich, things like that, where just moving money around allows you to do that. Now, spatial theory asks us to think about that is very much interconnected. So if I'm making policy, I have to have some idea of what that world is. But then immediately the problem becomes that the world in front of us is not bound by the same political boundaries that our policy making is, which is the states. But even if we look at, if you were to do a map of the flows of goods and services and just whatnot, you would find that most states, while we think of them as interconnected, are not fully interconnected. I mean, most of these things are going to go New York, London, Amsterdam, Paris. They're going to be parts of these states. And so when we start talking about what's in the interest of a state, we have to be very careful what that means. It can have a very uneven impact on a country. And so, again, there's a practical matter about formulating policy that when we loosen trade rules or we make them stricter in some cases, different parts of your country are going to be impacted for very precise reasons. And so from a pure practical standpoint, you have to have an understanding how that's going to operate in that sense. Now, I also think, going back to the illusion of false necessity, is that, as I said, a lot of times utopian is really just unrealistic. People talk about, oh, you can't have Tobin taxes, or you can't have a corporate tax that's a global corporate tax minimum tax of like 25% or something like that. Oh, we can't do that. Why? A lot of them will tell you, well, that's because economic laws, the yada, 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 the economy will crash, things like that. And the counter argument that seeks to limit your horizons is often based on some idea that the world is the way it is because it has to be that way. And I don't think that's true. So it's a mental check in the policy debate about what is realistic. And I also think, that you realize that the ways in which the material organization and mental, so all that stuff, are reflective of the world that's in front of us, the radical transformation of it simply can't happen overnight. And that a small tweaking of regulation here, the small tweaking of a tax policy there can actually have quite a significant impact over the long run. And so I think if you are someone who's interested in a more progressive politics, to use a term that's in American politics, that you shouldn't dismiss the little things, the tiny victories that accumulate over time. And I think that is, maybe from the policy maker's point of view, is an irrelevant one. But for those of us who want to be in that room, little victories add up over time, can have a significant impact. In a lot of ways, they can also have an impact by helping other people who would support you widen the horizons of what's possible. I don't know if that counts as, purely policy relevant, because most policy stuff, what they're doing is already pretty good. They just, their mentality of what's realistic is the problem, not their understanding of the world. I mean, most of us academics don't bring much to the table as far as policymakers are concerned, because we have to confront the reality of what can I get votes on. And as I told, when I worked on the campaign, we were saying, how do we tell all these miners in northern Minnesota, that's where I was working, that there's just no way they're going to get a job. And they were proposing a new mine, but I knew from the studies that it was going to be overwhelmingly mechanized, and it was going to use high-tech stuff, and all those old miners were not going to be hired back. And I said, they're not going to have that job. We need new policies. And someone came back and said, how do you tell a miner that he's just not going to get his job back? We have to give him hope. And I said, you're just giving him a delusion. He's not going to get that job back.
But you can give them hope by perhaps offering some kind of vocational training to get the new.
How do you tell a 50-year-old he's going to just learn to code?
Yeah, not necessarily code, perhaps, but yeah, I don't know, some other vocation.
Perhaps, but it's a tough sell. These guys have it in their bones. Because our candidate used to she liked to say that I'm the daughter of a miner and the granddaughter of a miner. This is stuff that lives over generations.
Yeah,
you see
of course.
it in them, and it's like, really?
It's an identity.
Yeah, and you can't push back. That's where the academic who wants an honest understanding of things confronts the political reality of what can be happened. That's what I'm saying. Focus on those small things where you can move the dial a little bit to get what they might understand.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. All right. Last question before we end this IR theory interview session. So any advice to our fellow IR students in Sweden, in Malaysia, all over the world?
Well, I mean, are they grad students or are they undergrads?
Yeah. Doesn't really matter. What comes to mind if you just what kind of advice would you like to give to students when they're studying IR?
Most of us come to this. Most of us come to this sort of thing because there's something about the world that makes us angry, something we want to change. We're angry at corporate power. We want to fix climate change or something like that. And there's something about the way in which we teach this discipline in a lot of cases where, we are teaching what is essentially positivist social science, and we try to think of things in strictly variables and whatnot. All can be useful, but it tends to destroy that normative side, the real political visions that brought us into it. And I think that we should hold on to that while also realizing that we do have to get a good understanding of how the world operates, but don't let that anger about what you wanted to change get smothered by those who will try and define what is realistic or what is genuinely scholarly. Don't let that happen. Ricci's old book, The Tragedy of Political Science, is no more relevant today than it was 20, 30 years ago when it came out. Those things drive us, and it is scholarship that tends to destroy it. And I say, don't let that happen. Learn things, and then go out there and do what you got to do. And then also realize that if you want to be an IR professor, that it's a tough road.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really tough road. But so in some sense, you're actually saying, to use your own concept, becoming, that students, they start IR with this anger or with this hope or with this aspiration or with this conviction that they can change things. But during the process of studying IR, they are becoming something different.
Destroyed.
They are destroyed.
They're destroyed.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Have you ever read The Tragedy of Political Science?
I haven't.
Yeah, they gave it to me my second year of grad school. And I thought, Christ, I can't believe I just read this thing. I don't know if I should be here anymore. Because it renders all of that world into something that's just studied like it's a couple of quarks, which I love studying. But I mean, that's not how the world, not studying, but I read about it. But I mean, that's not how the social world works. And it can really wring that out of you. But again, you do have to have an understanding how the world works. You just shouldn't get rid of that gut anger inside of you and push back against it, man. And you still got to fight a little bit. Take what you learn and fight. Get an education, not a diploma, I like to say. Learn. Don't care about that degree. Learn. Do something. And I think that's useful. One of my students sent me this thing. I don't know where she got it. She wrote something along the lines of like, the only authority I can respect is the teacher who had greater disrespect for the authority that exists in the world, but also taught me the tools and the language whereby I could criticize it and what else did she say? Something along the lines of like criticize it and, bring about the change and demolish the enemies in front, something like that. It was much more pithy, but she was basically saying, that angry professor can also be very useful for her own kind of, from what I could tell, she's an anarchist punk type of politics, which in the Malaysian context is even more radical than it seems. Like an anarchist at a U.S. institution is dime a dozen, but here, they can get your ass killed.
But I was actually thinking of stopping or ending quite soon. But since you mentioned what you just said, or the thing that you just said, how would you connect that? Or if we look at Weber's understanding of how a teacher ought to behave, Max Weber, I'm thinking about now. He says that the teacher should not be a demagogue, nor a prophet.
True.
And that aspect of teaching that you mentioned, that the teacher should criticize authority or should be, I don't remember the exact wording, but it sounded as if it was almost akin to a political role. Or did I misunderstand that?
Well, you could say it in two ways. One, when you criticize authority, you're also criticizing the authority of received wisdom, which is the challenge of orthodox social science, which you can do. So you can channel it in that sense. But then you have to remember your Gramsci, that there are different kinds of intellectuals. There's the intellectuals that define and justify the world, and there are the others who help us break it apart and understand how it works. And they're not saying like that you have to see the world how I see it, but let's look at how it works. And if you come to the same conclusions in your own, I taught a class once at Colgate, which is filled with wealthy students, we're talking like 1% wealthy students. And it was a class on privatization. Almost all of my students were econ majors, and a lot of them were libertarians. And one of them pulled me aside once. We still talk. He said, I thought this class was going to be all about how you privatize everything and why it's good. But now you make me think that it's not always good. And I said, I can't change your mind about things, but you need to understand how the world works so that whatever beliefs you have are not hidden behind illusions about how things are. And I try to do that. So my contempt for things is still personal. I don't tell them they should be that way. I'm like, you can have your opinions, but you should understand better where they come from and why you hold them. I like to say I can't make you care about the poor, but you have to find a better way of explaining why you don't. That seems fair.
Yeah, it does. It does. All right. So from Weber, you have to know your Gramsci, and perhaps also your Morgenthau in some sense, because you should speak truth to power.
Oh God, I've never had anyone invoke Morgenthau with me. Come on. I'd say read Le Fay or read Roberto Ungar. Those are two of my favorite authors. So.
Okay. All right. Now we have some to choose. All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Derick. Really nice to talk to you. And thanks for your insights. And thanks for telling us about the spatial theory of IR.
I wish I did a better job. But yeah.
You did a good job. You did a great job.
Thanks.
All the best. Take care.